that epiphany moment. And I was like, oh my gosh, how did this student loan debt crisis even start? Like, how was it born? How did it begin? Like, I didn't have it. I was like, this has to be like added in my book. This needs to be like a chapter in my book. I need to research this. I can't put this book out without having this information. And so, Jack, here's what I found out.
Hi, everyone. This is Jack Allwild with another Money episode. Today we have very special guest, Jason Brown. Jason, welcome to the show.
All right. Thanks so much, Jack. It's always great to talk to you and great to see you again, man. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. Before we get into how the student loan debt crisis happened and some of your journey going through school, not really incurring any debt, I do like to ask everyone, what was your relationship like with money growing up?
Man, that's such a good question, Jack. So I grew up, I guess, lower middle class might be the correct term. But the thing with me is I had my parents were very frugal and very, very fiscally responsible. So what I learned from them was just by observing their actions and behaviors. They never really set me down and like show me, talk to me about money. But what I observed was the things that I observed from my parents was like my dad never came home on a random Friday night with a brand new car. There were no impromptu, hey, we're all going on a Disney cruise trip next week. There was never a life like that. There was never like impulse spending, any kind of, crazy, purchases, like major purchases, nothing like that. So my parents were very, very, responsible with their money. And that was just something as a kid, like I just, I observed that. And of course you compare it to your friends, how they live, oh, well, so and so they just bought a big new house. How come we aren't not in a big house? You kind of compare, you get into that comparison trap. But then, I see my parents like how they live their life. And I will say my dad, when I got like in high school, my dad he took me down to, I think it was SunTrust Bank at the time, which is Truist Bank now. Like he took me to the bank and opened a checking account for me and kind of taught me how to, this is the old days where we had like checkbooks and you had to balance your checkbook. So that's kind of like the introduction to like budgeting. So he did do that for me. And he did so I do have, memories of my dad kind of setting up a checking account for me, kind of getting me started with bank accounts. And then he encouraged me to buy stock. So at the time, and I actually still have this stock. I bought I think I bought like 4 shares of Coca-Cola stock because that's all I could afford at the time. And I still have that stock. That was my first introduction into buying stocks. And, here in Atlanta, Coca-Cola is obviously a huge brand and, with it being started in Atlanta. So that's where I'm at. So Coca-Cola, I was like, oh, let's do Coke. That's always a good brand. So I think that stock is split many, many times over the years, and I think maybe I might have 30 shares now. I don't even know. But yeah, those are some of my, I guess, money related memories when it comes to my parents and my upbringing.
Awesome. So before we get into some of your experiences going through college, one thing you brought up in your book, It Is Possible, was the history around student loans. If you could give us an intro on
Yeah.
the history of
Yeah, this is Jack. This is such a good story because here's what happened. I had that book, the book where I talk about how I earned 2 debt-free degrees. It is possible. So I had that book completely written, right, Jack? And then I woke up in the middle of the night one night with like, that epiphany moment. And I was like, oh my gosh, how did this student loan debt crisis even start? Like, how was it born? How did it begin? Like, I didn't have it. I was like, this has to be like added in my book. This needs to be like a chapter in my book. I need to research this. I can't put this book out without having this information. And so, Jack, here's what I found out. So, uh, you may or may not heard of the Great Space Race. Some of the older listeners might remember that. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite into orbit and beat America into space. And you might be saying, "Well, Jason, what the heck does that have anything to do with the student loan debt crisis?" Well, give me a second to explain. So 2 months later, the U.S. they tried and failed to launch their own satellite. So basically, what's happening is the Soviet Union, they're kind of beating the Americans into space with their space exploration efforts. So the US feared that they were falling so behind in this space race that the president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, he was so embarrassed that he turned his focus on science and national security by giving high priority to scientific education. Now it's good to remember at the time in the late 50s, less than 8% of Americans even had a bachelor's degree. So most Americans, college wasn't really a thing, or it wasn't really an option, or maybe it just wasn't, most Americans probably just went to work. They just got a job and worked. So student loans weren't an option. Well, one of the reasons why they weren't an option is because, surprise, surprise, weren't really interested in loaning tens of thousands of dollars to teenagers. There's a shocker. So what would happen with Dwight Eisenhower, with President Eisenhower, was the next year, 1958, he signed what was called the National Defense Education Act, and that created the first federal loan program for students who were good at science, math, and engineering. So that's how this whole student loan, I guess, situation started, which of course has ballooned into a crisis. So to summarize, we are in a student loan debt crisis uh, solely because our country was humiliated when another country launched a rocket into space before us. So that's how all this started, which is quite fascinating. So fast forward to today, and it's obviously we know the statistics are crazy. It's like, I think it's 1.6 trillion now. It's hard to get a grasp. I know the Biden administration's forgiven a lot, some debt in different categories, but it's still hovering around 1.6 trillion, which is the second highest debt of all debt categories in our country, second to only mortgages. So mortgage debt would be the highest debt category, and then number two is student loan debt. So it's pretty bad.
Wow. So how did you decide coming out of high school that you wanted to avoid this debt trap?
Yeah. So to people can figure out my age here, but when I graduated in high school in the early 90s, so back then there really wasn't a student loan debt crisis. There wasn't all this stuff in the media about it. Obviously, it was going on. People were taking loans out for college, but it wasn't this like a national trending, political rhetoric narrative that we hear today. So really, for me though, it just was really my upbringing. So my parents were like, "Hey, if you want to go to college, you got to pay for it yourself." So what I did was I went to a local commuter school called Kennesaw State University, which is just north of Atlanta. It's actually a massive school now. At the time, it was a very small school. And I lived at home, and it was 7 miles from campus. I lived at home. So those are some of the reasons that I was able to pay my way. I lived at home. I was an in-state public school, and I worked. I worked like three part-time jobs, and did a lot of other things. I earned scholarships and stuff too. But like, to go back to your question, like there was no mindset in 1993 like, hey, I gotta avoid the dreaded student loan debt crisis. I got how do I do this? It was really, for me, like, I was always taught, debt, you can't pay for it unless it can afford to, right? So debt wasn't really an option. Like, I didn't have credit cards or anything like that. It was just like, hey, if you want to do it, you got to pay for it. And if you want to pay for it, you got to go get a job. So I know these might be antiquated, things that, we hear today, but yeah, that's kind of what, how my mindset was during my undergrad years.
I'm kind of curious, has your mindset changed at all in terms of taking out debt? Maybe now that you have like a mortgage, maybe you view debt a little differently. How have your views changed
Uh,
over the years?
Yeah, my view, that's a good question, Jack. My views have changed more so. This is maybe one thing that me and Dave Ramsey would agree on is I hate debt. I hate all debt. I don't really believe that there's good debt and bad debt. As my dad said it more accurately, my dad would say there's reasonable debt and unreasonable debt,
Okay.
it makes more sense. Like most people can't pay cash for a house or a car, big purchases. So that would be like more of a reasonable debt. Hey, I need a car to get to work. So, that's a reasonable, or, even student loans. Hey, I'm investing in myself. So that's a reasonable, you can view it that way. But for me, man, I I got into really, really bad credit card debt when I was in my 20s. And I've since, paid that off, and I cut up my credit cards, and I haven't used a credit card in probably 25 years. So yeah, I'm anti-credit, and just look at the interest rates now. I mean, they're 25 to 35% on some of these credit cards, which is, it's almost like criminal. It's like these rates are criminal. So Yeah, so for me, like, I guess to answer your question, do I look at debt differently? It's really like I do everything I can to avoid debt. And
Mhm.
so I look at like a lot of people say, oh, you should, savings account, like the money nerds that we meet at FinCon. Oh, savings account is you're losing money because you put it in a savings account at a bank and you're getting 0.001%, whatever. Yeah, you're not earning interest, but what a savings account is, it's simply insurance against debt. That's really all it is. It's preventing you from swiping the credit card. Like I was just telling you, off camera, our hot water heater went out and we had to pay $873 to repair it. Well, guess what? We didn't swipe that on a credit card and then we're going to pay 30% interest on it every month. We took that money out of our savings account, which some people will call it an emergency fund or emergency, savings or whatever it may be. And then we took that out to avoid, putting it on debt. So those are some of my views on debt these days.
Any thoughts on building credit? If so, because I know a lot of people are like, well,
Yeah.
Jason, how do I start out? I mean,
Yeah, that's a good see it's such a that whole thing is so weird because people like Clark Howard will say your credit score should be zero, because that just means that you don't need, to take out debt or whatever. Or that means you're living, on cash. You're paying everything on cash. So to build credit is really probably the safest way. I would say you're going to have to obviously, pay off debt. So I would say like get a credit card with like a $500 limit or $1,000. Get a credit card that has a very low limit that you're not going to ruin your life with. Or you can go and get like we have a Kohl's store charge card, something like that. Maybe you go to Target and they have a maybe like a department store card that you could pay off. Back when I was in college, people had gas cards. I don't know if that's still a thing. Like you would get like, oh, I go to Texaco and I have a gas card. It's just like a little, I guess, charge card, and then you could pay that off every month. So I guess just starting to build like small steps towards building credit. That's kind of what you would want to see. And then, obviously me as an adult now, like when I pay, if, when you pay your mortgage on time, when I pay all my bills on time, that will help the credit score, I guess, as long as you're not falling behind on payments and whatnot. So that's really what they're looking for. That's how you're going to get dinged, I guess. But yeah, like I have three young sons, and if my oldest son he's going off to college, and he would ask me, hey, he would ask me the question you just asked. I'll say, okay, go ahead and get yourself like a credit card with a $500 limit, and just budget your money every month that credit card comes in. And if you owe $75 on it each month, you better make sure you've got that money to pay down that full payment each month. So that's kind of, I guess, my advice on that. Because it's kind of like a necessary evil. I guess you're going to need to have a credit score if you want to take out a loan to buy a car or a house or anything else, any other big purchase that you might want to make.
yeah, actually, at FinCon, I heard there's a company called Rental Karma, and then I sat in on a Zillow discussion. They were saying if you pay through their portals for rent, you can actually get that rent applied to your credit score. That was kind of cool too. I hadn't heard of that before.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a good. I had not heard that either. But yeah, I think there's probably lots of unconventional ways like that to build your credit score. Yeah, that's really good to know.
Yeah. So going into your master's degree, why don't you talk a little bit about your master's degree, how you went about that?
Oh, sure. Well, let me actually, I'll go back and let me finish the story of the undergrad because there were some other things. So just to let everybody know how I earned a debt-free undergrad degree. So attended in-state public school, lived at home, I actually worked two on-campus jobs, and then I worked one job across the street. There was a mall, and so I worked a retail job. So I literally had three part-time jobs. So I was paying what they call, pay as you go. So that's what I was doing. So, but I also earned scholarships. So at one point, I actually got a job at Chick-fil-A, and Chick-fil-A has a scholarship program, which back then it's nowhere near as good as their program now is tremendous. But back then you had to work there for 2 years and you would get $1,000 uh,
Okay.
scholarship. So I did that, which back then I was on the quarter system, so $1,000 paid for 2 quarters, so almost an entire year. So that's how cheap it was. That's how cheap it was. I was paying about $550 a quarter. That was just for tuition, not books. But Chick-fil-A now, Jack, they pay it, they'll give you you can earn a $2,500 scholarship each year. So if you work there for 4 years, you could potentially earn $10,000 in scholarships. Now that's just for being an employee, right? Now they also have a bigger, like a national scholarship, which that's for like all their employees. So that's highly competitive to get. But I want to say they award maybe like each year like 10 to 15 of these, and they're like 25 to 30 grand. So
Wow.
they have bigger, yeah. So they have a much more robust scholarship program now than back in the day when I was there. So I got the scholarship at Chick-fil-A. Now, the other thing, Jack, I was really, really at the time undergrad, I was pursuing like a career in sports journalism, sports broadcasting, stuff like that. So I worked as a student assistant with the athletic department, and they really didn't have a budget to pay me. So I did a lot of that. I got a lot of like internship credits and stuff like that for doing it, but really like I was just doing it for the experience and the love of sports and networking and meeting friends and stuff like that. So what happened was because the athletic department, they couldn't pay me like a salary or whatever, a hourly rate. They kind of got creative with compensation. So my junior year, they actually gave me a book scholarship. So I had all my books paid for through the athletic scholarship. And then my senior year, now I love telling this story. My senior year, they put me on a full athletic scholarship, books, tuition, everything. So my senior year of college, by the way, I was a non-athlete and I received an athletic scholarship. And I think I'm the first person to ever do that in my history of my school. And I certainly hope I didn't take a scholarship away from a real, true athlete. I don't think I did, but I think that was just their creative way of compensating me. So they just gave me a full scholarship. So that was tremendous. Like I had a whole year of school paid for, and that changed, that really, Jack, that was a life changer for me, man. That was so helpful. um, so that was the undergrad, how I did it. Now moving on to the master's degree. So when I went back to school, it was exactly 15 years of time had elapsed. So I went back to school in 2016 was when I started my grad program at the same school, Kennesaw State. So what happened then was I was actually an employee at Kennesaw State. So these are two completely different stories of how I paid or how I avoided student loan debt. So I was an employee at Kennesaw State. And as an employee, and I didn't know this until one of my friends was working in the grad admissions office. He says, "Hey, Jason, like we've got this great, professional writing program, and since you're an employee here, the school pays for it." I was like, "Are you serious? Well, let me look into it." So I actually I thought about it for an entire year, and I was like, "Well, I don't even know, even if the school pays for it." So I've got the financial barrier removed, but I still have a time barrier. Like I have to commit time to this. And at the time, like I was married and we were expecting our first child, and there was a lot going on. And I was like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to pull this off. But eventually I decided to do it because I've decided, oh, I'm gonna have more regret if I don't try. So sure enough, I did it. So it's called the TAP program. It's which stands for Tuition Assistance Program. So I had the school paid for all of my tuition, but I still had to pay for all my books out of pocket. And we know how expensive that can be. Even if buying used books, I bought a lot of my books used on Amazon and eBay and stuff like that. But so I still applied for scholarships. So I applied for several just to cover the cost of books. And I ended up earning two scholarships, smaller amounts. I earned a $500 scholarship and I earned a $1,000 scholarship. So $1,500 total, which more than paid for any books that I need. So at the end of the day, I actually made money going to grad school. So it was completely paid for. I had a few, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred extra dollars, in my pocket from those book scholarships. So that's and then so what happened, Jack, is that before I finished, I think I had 2 semesters left in my master's program and I changed jobs. So I got the job that I have now. I'm back into the private sector in the corporate world. And I was like, oh, shoot, me and my wife were trying to figure out, okay, well, we're trying to budget. Okay, well, we'll just pay out of pocket for my last two. It was about 3 grand a semester, I think, is what I was paying, is what I would have had to pay. So, but luckily and thankfully, my current job, they have tuition reimbursement program. So I found that out when I first, when I came in, for the HR orientation, I was going through all the benefits and stuff. And I said, oh, what's this? What's this tuition reimbursement program? How does that work? And let me go ahead and sign up for that. That was the first thing I did on my first day on the job. And sure enough, they paid the company I have now. They reimbursed me for my final 2 semesters of grad school. So that made it to 100%, debt free. So that's kind of how I did it.
Awesome. Love the story. I mean, if someone were to come to you and say they absolutely needed to take debt out to get a master's, or that maybe they're, you know, like 10 or so years out of undergrad and looking to go back, how would you like talk them through like analyzing
Yeah.
that decision?
Yeah. So you're saying if someone says, "Hey, I mean, debt's my only option," well, that's the first thing I would tell them. Like, debt is not your only option, and that's really the problem with this student loan debt crisis. And I call it a student loan debt scam because our students are being scammed into thinking that debt is the only way, the only option to go to school, and that's simply not true. There's over, you've heard people like Dave Ramsey say there's over $100 million a year of unclaimed scholarships. And some people think it's way more than that. Well, first of all, if someone says, "Hey, what do I do? Like, how do I avoid the debt?" It's like, okay, well, if you might still have to take out some debt, but there's lots of ways to lessen the debt, right? So you can work, you can pick up an extra job, you can go to your employer and see if they have a tuition reimbursement program. This is a big trend right now. Is these a lot of companies are offering tuition reimbursement, and they're getting positive news media coverage because of it. And even if you don't have a company that offers it like as part of their HR benefit package, you can still go to your boss and assuming that the program or course you want to take is related to your job. You say, "Hey, like for me, like I'm a technical writer, so I took this professional writing course." Say, "Hey, I want to take this program and it directly relates to this writing job I have. Would the company be willing to, help me out with that?" And you might be surprised. They might say, "Hey, we'll pay half of it, or we'll pay a percentage of it, or hey, we'll pay all of it, or whatever," because it helps. Not only does it help you individually, it helps the company and it helps you do better in your job. So that's a way you can do it. There's lots of other, like I said, there's so many scholarships and grants out there, and what I've seen is a lot of people kind of shy away from the smaller amounts because oh, well, like me, like I got a $500 and $1,000 scholarship. I'm like, well, I need $30,000. What am I going to do with $500 or $1,000? But what if you earned 10 of those or 20 of those, because that's the low hanging fruit. And see, people want to go after the, "Hey, I want the $50,000 scholarship, I want the $100,000, like I just talked about with the Chick-fil-A one." But guess what, the competition for that is so much greater because obviously it's a bigger number. But if you go after like the low hanging fruit ones, you might all that adds up. So that's another thing you can do. Obviously, like I mentioned it before, public you can save so much money by staying in state and going to a public school. I mean, tremendous amount of money doing that. Just even if another thing. Oh, here's another thing I did. I went like I did this a little bit in undergrad and grad school. Is I kind of went part time. So I was going. So what I was doing, I was taking like one or two classes at a time because that's all I could afford to pay for. But then I was also going year round. So I was going in the summer too. So I'll take like one or two classes in the summer, and that was how I kind of spread it out so I could make it more affordable, I guess. So I could just kind of pay as you go. So there's different ways to do it. But I would just encourage someone who's like, "Hey, look, don't believe the lie of our society and culture that says the only way you can get higher education is through taking out debt. There's so many different ways around it, and there's so many great resources out there. Not just my book, but there's tons of other books and podcasts and shows like yours, Jack, that speak the truth into people. That just show, hey, there's so many different ways and so many different resources out there that are in place to help people avoid the debt."
Mhm. In terms of like as a society, in terms of corrective actions, like, and you called it a scam. So do you think it's as simple as getting the government out of the lending business? Would that alleviate all of these issues?
Oh man, that's wow, that's a deep question, Jack. Um, that's hard to say. I think the issue is that our society is based on debt, and debt is big business in our country, in our culture, in our world. Okay, so I actually interviewed. There was a girl that I interviewed in my book, and she said, "Jason, if it weren't for the fact that she went in for orientation, like the college orientation, she went into some meeting or whatever, and I guess it was like a financial aid presentation, and she said the only options they presented to her were debt." option A, option B, option C. She said if my dad wasn't in that room with me, she said her dad literally dragged her out of the room, like grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the room and said, no, 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 we're not doing this. And see, that's the that's when I say it's a scam. It's like the only options that are being presented to people is debt. And so why is that? It's because, you know, it's easy to take it. Debt's the easy way out. Okay. Then a lot of people don't want to hear this, but it's like, it's just too easy. Like, let me just take the debt and then I'll worry about paying it off later. Cause hey, after I get out of college, I'm going to have a big six-figure job. And, sometimes it doesn't work out that way. And, I'm only going to take out a little bit of debt. And then, when you're 17 years old, you don't understand the power of compounding interest, and if you don't start paying it immediately after you graduate college, you're going to wake up and be 45 years old and still have $50,000 of student loan debt. But yeah, to go back to your original question, Jack, I'm not really sure. I mean, because before the government took it over, it was mostly private, right? So I don't know if you kind of compare and contrast, like, oh, before the government pretty much took over the majority of it, like they have now in present day. Before it was private. So I don't know if one was better than the other. I mean, maybe like the interest rates might have been a little bit lower through government, loans versus private. There may have been less, fraudulent activity, I guess, through government, versus private. But I'm not really sure if you, like you said, if you take the government out of it, I don't know if that really solves the problem or not.
Mhm.
It's just that the astronomical, cost of school. Like the cost of school has gone up 1,600% since 1975, and that outpaces anything else in our economy, like by far. But why is that? And that's because as long as they keep giving out the loans, the cost of the schools are going to go up. So it's kind of like the schools are kind of in bed with the government a little bit
Yeah.
on, it's that's kind of how I see it. People have different theories though.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think of that because, like, if you go to a private person, they might underwrite, some 18-year-old that wants to major in art differently than someone that wants to be a doctor. So I
Exactly.
could see,
That's true.
yeah. So, but yeah, well, okay. Yeah. Definitely an interesting thought experiment. But as we're winding down, Jason, I kind of stole this from you in the Orlando FinCon. You were going around asking people the best and worst personal finance advice they had heard or received. So I'm going to ask you that same question. What is the best and worst personal finance advice you've heard or received?
Wow, that's so good, man. I don't know if I have any like major words. I'm trying to think of like what did my grandparents tell me, or what did my parents tell me. It's so cliched, but it's just the whole like don't buy something you can't afford. And I love Dave Ramsey's quote where he says, or I might butcher this, but when he talks about don't buy something you don't need to impress somebody you don't like.
Okay.
I can't forget the rest of it, but I'm screwing it up. So that's but really like my mom would always say, just if you can't afford it, you can't buy it. So um now different people have different, thoughts on that. Like, oh, if I can't afford it, I can just go get a loan and take it. So, it just really depends on your money mindset, I guess. But for me, it's like if you can't afford it and I don't want to take out debt, that makes me more creative and more resourceful of like, okay, how like with the student loans we just talked about. Okay, I don't want to take out debt, so how do I get resourceful? How do I get creative to pay for this? And not saying like, oh, well, I can't afford it, so I'm just not going to do it and I just give up. It's like, okay, well, let me see how can I find another way to accomplish this goal of acquiring this education or this car or this house. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. Now, what was the other one? The
Yeah.
worst financial advice? Man, that's good too.
I'm sure there's a lot out there. So pick.
Man, all these trends of like, oh, you got to invest in, I just interviewed a guy named Gabe Bolt. He's got a great YouTube channel. We talking about FinCon, and he was talking about how he invested in altcoins, and I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I guess it's like kind of like Bitcoins, and he's like he lost 5 grand in altcoins because that was like a trending thing, like some of this things. But I would just say like for me, like the worst advice is that, you gotta have like you gotta have a new car, if you're gonna be like when you first start out, like in in life, like you get your first professional job and people like, oh well, you got to look the part, and you got to buy the new car so people will take you seriously, right? You don't want to like show up to work with like a 20-year-old Honda Accord all beat up. Like you got to have a nice car. Well, 22-year-old recent college graduate might not be able to afford a brand new $50,000 car. So that's kind of one of the ones too. It's just, don't, I guess, don't fall into that whole comparison trap of what society and culture will tell you to do. I know those are long-winded answers, but yeah, there's so much, with that. What's funny is like people will see those, the TikTok. I think that's a
Oh,
big thing. Like worst advice you've heard on social media about money, and those are always funny. But yeah, those would be some of my thoughts on that.
awesome. Well, Jason, I always like talking to you. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can go buy your books or get in
Oh,
touch with
sure. Yeah, probably the best place. I've written a couple of books, money related books. I've got a YouTube channel and blogs and a bunch of resources, but you can find all of that on my website, which is yourmarginmatters.com. So you go to my website and you'll find all my resources there. You can learn more about my books, YouTube channel, just like you have, Jack, as well as my blogs. And there's actually I have a ton of scholarship resources on my website too.
you.
There's a whole bunch of websites, links to different websites if people are interested in more information on scholarships and stuff.
Awesome. Well, that's a great resource. Yeah, we'll be sure to link to that. And it's been a pleasure.
I appreciate you having me on, Jack. I hope somebody learned something today.
Yeah. Until next time.